tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa.
So a couple weeks ago, just before Vesak, there was the request to talk a bit about relationship as a natural unfolding of this Dharma life reset we've been in. So we looked at this model of the Buddhas, how we are in this web of reciprocal relationships, visualizable in 6 directions, with different types of relationship in the different directions. You know, parents in the East and spouses and children in the West, and friends and peers in the North, and tutors or teachers in the South, and spiritual teachers and ascetics above, and workers and those who support our well-being like a foundation below, and the way that we are always in webs of responsibility, accountability, relationality with this web of people. And so continuing a bit in that theme, coming back to relationality in the sense of how we speak to each other. One of the primary ways that we interact in so many of our relational types or fields, we speak to each other. And it's important enough that the Buddha gave it an entire limb of the Eightfold Path. Wise or right speech, samma vaca, samma, right or wise, balanced, appropriate, skillful, and vaca, V-A-C-A, speech, speaking. It's, of course, it's one of the of the 5 lay precepts, and the 4th in the Theravadan list, anyway. After non-harming, not stealing, not committing sexual misconduct as the first 3, those are the 3 bodily precepts, and then the 4th speaks to speech, and the 5th, the precept against intoxicants, speaks to the mind. And this is a classic division of the aspects of our being for the Buddha into body, speech, and mind, which sometimes sits in an interesting relationship to the kind of modern kind of psychological understanding of us as having aspects that we might call body, heart, and mind, very commonly. Thinking about sensation, emotion, and thinking as 3 different kinds of experience. In the Buddhist system, thinking and thoughts and emotions, or thinking and feeling, are never really held as separate. Right? They're really thought of together, really understanding that thoughts always come with an emotional tone, and that emotions always, almost always in a way, come with some kind of narrative, or they're embedded in our narrative. So many of our emotions are relational, and so they're embedded in the narrative of how we are with others. Thoughts and feelings always expressing also through bodily energy and sensation, and so there's really no separation between these aspects. But for the Buddha, in the Buddha's teachings, body, speech, and mind, in a way, are 3 kinds of experience, but maybe more than that, they're 3 kinds of expression. So if we think about them ethically, like in the precepts, there's what we can do physically. And physically, there's these ways that we can harm others through violence or theft or sexual misconduct, and ways that we can care for others, caring for others' bodies and property and sexual energy. And then there's these actions that come through the words that we use. And so the precept on right or wise speech. In some of the formulations, the precepts are given not as the 5 lay precepts, but the 5th one is dropped, and you get the 3 physical, and then you get wise speech broken out into 4, right? Refraining from lying, harsh, divisive speech, harsh speech, and nonsense or idle chatter. And sometimes these are broken out into 4 separate disciplines. And then there's disciplines relating to kind of emotional or mental states. In the 5 precepts, you get the 3 bodily precepts, the precept around right speech, and then the precept around not misusing intoxicants because they cloud the mind. And so the 5th precept is really about maintaining clarity of mind. So we maintain clarity through our physical actions with each other, clarity through our words with each other, and clarity through the way that we tend our mind to be clear, because an unclear mind is one of the primary conditions for misconduct in the first 4 precepts, right? Having an unclear mind is one of the ways that we can stumble into wrong speech or misconduct of many kinds. So speech is a vehicle for understanding, for communication, for the transmission and receiving of energy. It stitches us together in webs that are sometimes called interpretive communities. That's an academic term for the group of people who understands a certain discourse. So, if I start talking about formal philosophical logic, some of y'all who have some training in that will understand that, be part of that interpretive community. And others of y'all might be like, yeah, it's kind of Greek to me, because it is kind of Greek. So, or if I start, talking really like, like socialist Marxist political discourse, and I start using kind of Marxist language to talk about things, there's an interpretive community for that. Some of y'all will be like, oh yeah, I know this discourse, I'm down with that, I can get into, conversation about the means of production and whatever we're talking about. And others might be like, that's not where my interest has been, that's not my training, and I don't understand those, that discourse in that way. And so whenever we're using speech, we are always relational. Even if I'm speaking to myself, I'm speaking in modes of discourse or frameworks that I've learned by being in the social location and the positionality that I'm in. So, I also speak to myself or with myself coming from or being in the the psychological and attachment and family systems that I come from. And so if I find that I have a tendency, let's say, to speak harshly to myself or impatiently, I might notice that that when I do so, there's something really familiar about that. And if I really feel into that or inquire into that, I might find, oh, that's how my father spoke to me. Or that's how, or that's how all the people in my school community talked with each other, or this is how, my community talks. And so, I'm a member of many interpretive communities, and I will talk with myself to myself in ways that are trained by those communities. And I'm starting with this because I want us to start right off the bat with the understanding that our speech is conditioned, it's contextual, that language is shared with others, and almost everything we think either in words or images, but the thinking that's in words is almost entirely going to be in a language. And languages themselves have a kind of a bounded interpretive community, languages like English, for instance, where the genders of nouns are invisible, where it's not clear whether the window or the table are like male or female or neuter. That's a different thing than a language like French or German, where they are, And in German there's a neuter, but in French there's not, right? So like wherever you're speaking, there's going to be these details. There's going to be those languages where there's not really a word for, a certain concept. Um, and these built-in frameworks affect not just what we can say, but how we can think. Because if you don't have a word for something, it's very difficult to think about it. And this is partly why radical social movements often focus so strongly on coming up with the right words for things, and sometimes to their detriment can focus too much on policing the words for things, but also can be extremely creative in finding words for things. Because once there's a word for something, someone can recognize themselves in it. And there's a beautiful body of evolution that happens in language as languages begin to, languages themselves morph as they are used to describe the reality of the culture that's using them. And so as the culture changes, as people's lives change, and someone says, I don't see the right word out there to name myself with in a way that's kind. I need a new word. That word is always found. Someone will find it, right? Or make it up. And then this beautiful thing happens where something becomes thinkable, a thought that was previously difficult to think about. And that's going to really mean also feelings that are difficult to feel become more feelable once we have words for them. And it's not to say that you can't feel something that you don't have words for. You feel things all the time that you don't have words for. And that's partly what music is for, that's partly what poetry is for, that's partly what dancing is for. The old can you describe to me such and such a thing? And you might be like, I'm not sure I can, but give me a few minutes of interpretive dance and I'll try to show you. And I'm from a community that would totally do that. Be like, I'm not sure, but let me show you what this feels like, and we would do something and be like, oh yeah, that resonates with me. I move like that too, or I feel like that movement, right? So those are languages as well. And part of what I like about this as a doorway to thinking about words and speech is that when I look at, and when we look at the guidelines on right speech, and the first guideline is always, speak what is true, so don't lie. There's kind of two ways that folks usually practice with this first precept. One is to take it, fairly literally and strongly, like, yeah, don't tell obvious intentional lies. And then you might be like, yeah, I pretty much don't do that, so I'm good. That's sort of level one, is like, don't do that. And you're like, okay. The thing that sincere practitioners really trying to understand and be free from suffering often do then is that they'll take that precept and they'll make it really subtle. What are the places where I didn't tell the entire truth, like I was a little veiled or a little protected, and I said a little bit, I said what was true, but I also withheld something, or I shaped it in a way to protect myself a little bit. I told a certain version of the story that that I can tell, even if it worked fine out in my relationships, I could tell, oh, there was a tiny bit of defensiveness, or there was a little sort of avoiding the sting of something by the way that I said it. So this is a beautiful way to practice also with this, the precept to not lie. You could take it in the direction of like not lying to myself, and all of these are beautiful practices. What are the ways that I tell myself something, a story about how I am, that it's true, but it could be better, or I'm not quite getting to the heart of it, And all of these are ways to say like the precept is not about coming up with, some strict like bar to clear, and then if you've cleared that bar, like you're good, you don't have to think about it. The precept is there to, you know, like the rumble strip at the side of the road, you start to feel the sort of the vibration when you get close to something, Sometimes I'll be in a conversation that's difficult, and I'll find that because the emotions are strong, my standard reaction is to get overwhelmed, and then I can't find words. I get really silent. And if I really investigate in that moment, I'll find that one of the things that's happening is I'm trying to put words to a feeling, and the words are never quite right. They always feel like they're not quite true enough, or they're missing something, or they're distorting something, or I'm just afraid to say them. And in all of these ways, I can't quite get there. And so practicing with the precept that says, speak what's true, becomes a whole body of work to not just run over my own boundaries and say things that are inappropriate, like it's true, and I don't care what anyone thinks. I could do that, right? Or I could, or I could speak in a way that's like true but maybe hurtful to someone, or technically true but not really helpful, or unkind to myself. All of these ways where I'll see the ways that essentially my psyche is trying to avoid dukkha, is trying to avoid pain by maneuvering in the words that I'm speaking in some way. And I want to see that and let the precept to speak what's true vibrate me in that moment, so that I can feel like, oh wait, I'm on the edge of something. I want to be clear and true, but also kind and helpful here. So this is where the further guidelines then, beyond just speaking what's true, come in. All right, so the classical four are speak what's, or refrain from speaking that which is untrue, that which is divisive, that which is harsh, and that which is useless, essentially. So I'm trying not to speak what's untrue. And so, but I also want to, for instance, speak in a way that promotes concord. So this is very core for the Buddha. He founded an intentional community. It was very important for the monastics and the lay people to all figure out how to repair when there's rupture, how to speak well together, to care for the relationships. And so to not speak in a way that's divisive is the second guideline, right? So I could say something that's true, in some way, right? I could say, some of y'all are wealthier than some others of y'all, right? Like technically true, because there's always going to be a range of wealth in the room. And I could say that in a way that divides the Sangha, Like we just went through this whole process trying to figure out how to do like monthly donations and like something called membership, but I didn't like the word membership. And, and the thing motivating us, we wrestled a lot with the words to use for this thing, a payment structure for belonging to a group, because I felt really sensitive to setting something up that would be class exclusive, or anyone would feel, excluded, or, or that like, okay, you're here, you got past the Sangha paywall and now you're on the in group, you know? Um, the guideline that speech should be not only true, but supporting concord is this beautiful guideline. And of course, as you know, some of us being politically oriented social radicals, some of whom who have been occasionally inspired to, you know, chime in on a social media comment thread, like, you know, dangerous. How much divisive speech, you know, is out there. I'll just fire off a quick tweet in response to this thing somebody said, you know. Um, uh, you know, I saw a cartoon at one point, super late at night, you know, partner says, "Sweetie, come to bed." The partner is in front of a computer typing furiously, and the caption is, "I can't. Something is happening out there on the internet." You know, like I have to respond. Um, so, you know, watch out for that. So the guideline that, you know, to avoid speech that's false, but also speech that's divisive, and to really feel into. And I started this talk pointing to interpretive communities. Often divisive speech and harsh speech, which is the next, you know, guideline to avoid harsh speech, often these come in either when we feel like our particular interpretive community is at risk or vulnerable. And so then there's either, you know, use of speech to protect an interpretive community by pushing out others, or to, you know, defend one's point of view in a way that might fragment an interpretive community into multiple camps. You know. And so, you know, can we orient toward our speech in a way where the speech is has the purpose of bringing people together, right? Of mending discord and division, and doing so in a way that isn't harsh. And the last of the guidelines is to speak in a way that's useful, um, and but the more pointed way that the texts say is to avoid idle chatter, and you know, or speaking nonsense. Uh, you know, as a social being who loves chit chat, I want to say that it's possible to overinterpret that fourth guideline and think that you only have to talk, you know, seriously about the Dharma and, you know, serious things in the world and nothing else. Um, but I don't interpret it that way at all. I think that, you know, talking about the weather and, you know, sports teams and music and beautiful things and, you know, how lovely somebody's outfit is, um, isn't idle at all, actually. And this is how we stitch relationships together. This is how we grow to know each other. And um, but I think it's a great guideline to just have, you know, sort of in your periphery when you're chatting with your crew over, you know, treats at the shop or wherever you do your treat, drink, chatting business. Um, on headphones, on Discord while you play video. I don't know what you do, you know. But to notice when um, I think the idea to avoid idle chatter suggests noticing when our speech is no longer connective. It's not actually giving rise to a feeling of deepening intimacy, and instead it's kind of, you know, bubbling off in some direction, often which has a kind of harshness to it. I remember um, very early in my kind of teenage years, um, I I became really I got really uncomfortable with embarrassment and sarcasm. And I mean I'm Gen X, like embarrassment and sarcasm were kind of like our jam, right? But I remember our family would just, you know, watch the evening sitcoms, um, and uh, and so many sitcoms, the plot essentially hinges on embarrassment. Like something's happening, some complicated situation gets set up, and right about at like minute 20, you know, after the last commercial batch before the end, it's going to happen, right? You know, the kid is going to get caught doing something with somebody with the wrong, it's going to be embarrassing. And I remember getting up and just leaving the room. And like I would just go for a snack, or I would take that moment to go and pee or something. And I would notice that my heart was kind of racing. And and you know, and I remember at one point like my sister being like, "Where are you going?" And I'm like, "I'm going to get a snack." And um, but what I could have said was, "I don't like this. I don't like this story. It doesn't make me feel good." You know, like the peak of this show is going to be humiliating somebody in some little way, you know, and I don't like it. Um, and and I think part of what practicing with right speech, uh, you know, part of what it'll do for us, you know, fair warning, is make us really sensitive at times to the general media ecosystem and how harsh a lot of speech is and how divisive a lot of speech is. Um, and really begin to watch out for uh, styles of speech like sarcasm or deep irony, you know. And of course, we're in a moment right now where these have been, you know, in a certain way, deeply weaponized. You know, that it's a known strategy on the on the radical fringe on the right wing in this country. It exists a little bit on the radical left as well, but more on the radical right, to frame um, inappropriate or violent opinions as humor. And people, you know, this has been widely commented on, that you know you can say the racist thing or the misogynistic thing or the homophobic thing or the transphobic thing, um, you know, kind of with impunity if you say it as a funny meme. And there's always the like, you know, I was just being funny, right? And um, but of course it's not, and of course it's harsh and divisive and you often untrue, you know, in all of these ways. But you might um, play with these suggestions, you know, really look out for speech that is untrue, divisive, harsh, and and idle, you know, in a kind of like really not serving connection and intimacy kind of way. And so I think the analysis here partly is to learn how to recognize the tendencies toward those kinds of speech in ourselves and avoid them, but also to practice being in a kind of, you know, deconstructive mode in the culture at large, you know, like, you know, uh, annoyingly to me, um, the the brand of oat milk at the moment that for a lot of folks I know has the best recipe, like it's the best tasting oat milk, has a really obnoxious marketing strategy, and their brand voice is like hyper ironic, and um, and one of the things that has happened is that I have a 9-year-old who has now learned to read and reads everything, and he's but he's not yet learned irony. It doesn't make any sense to him. And even if like a few times in parenting, I'll slip up, particularly when I'm upset and I'm sort of at the end of my rope, and I'll say something sarcastic, you know, um, and I always immediately regret it, you know, if like, you know, um, uh, you know, those little asides that are like, you know, like even a little aside, like, yeah, that's great. And, like my kid will be like, why did you say that was great? Like, it's clearly not great. And I'm like, oh, yeah, yeah, I was upset. That was sarcastic. I'm sorry I said that. What I should have said was, that hurts. I don't like this. And and so, he's reading the oat milk box and he's like, Dad, what do they mean by da 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 da? And I'm like, wow, how do I explain like hyper ironic brand marketing to you? And I've it's been great to try to explain it and to be like, they're doing this thing where they're saying this thing that doesn't make sense, and it doesn't make sense in such an extreme way that it's kind of funny to some people who like that kind of thing. And they want you to think it's funny in a way that you'll buy more oat milk. But they're saying that they don't care about you buying more. Like, they're saying it in a certain way so that, and I'm like, try to break it down. And then I'm just um and then, his response is kind of just like, that's weird, you know? And I'm like, it is totally weird. Like, you know, 100 years ago, it was just like, buy our oat milk. It's the best oat milk. And that was the jingle. And now it's so weird. And so, the right speech guidelines teach us to, interpret culture in a like through this lens of, you know, is this is this a good use of language? Is this wholesome, really? Because, remember that the speech guidelines they're a practice of mindfulness and, care for each other and maintaining of connection. uh, because they're relational, they're fundamentally an ethics practice, right? Because speech is a kind of action. Speech is part of the action limbs. And so, underlying all of this is the understanding that words have impacts, that words are real, that they can hurt, you know. Um, I mean, you know, every kid who's like ever come home crying because somebody said something knows that, that old thing about like sticks and stones and breaking bones and words never hurt. It's completely not true, right? Words totally hurt. And, and we've all been hurt by words. And so to understand words and speaking as, as a deeply relational, ethical action, and then using these guidelines to paint for us a picture of a kind of interaction that favors concord, that favors interpretive communities where we can speak to each other about what's true and understand each other. So building up, vocabularies and ways of speaking where we are coherent to each other, uh, non-divisive, gentle. Gentle doesn't always mean like mild, right? You can speak non-harshly in a way that's quite forceful, and in activist speech and political speech, but also, intimate relationship speech. Sometimes it's completely necessary to do so, but also, to really practice with the difference between, um, forceful speech and harsh speech, right? Kind of like the difference between, righteous anger and like bitter, hurtful ill will and rage that just wants to cause harm. And then all the way to, this guideline to speak in a way that's useful. Sometimes that fourth one is spun into timely, right? Just to say something at the right time. So I think as we do this, really understand how profound speech is in our tending of our relationships this can become a way that we understand, how we speak to ourselves and each other very powerfully as a practice of tending, of care, of compassion, of loving kindness for each other, but also of clear seeing, really trying to understand as deeply as I can where the dukkha is, where the pain is in this situation, and help others through my words also to understand, what hurts in this moment, and could we do this better? Can we tell a better story, but also can we just speak to each other more skillfully, not just more kindly, but more skillfully in a way that leads to more beneficial results. Beneficial here always, in a way, means with more intimacy, more connection rather than disconnection, more understanding rather than just missing each other, as happens so often. All right. Pausing there for now. Thanks for your warm and wise listening.